Hi and welcome to the 54th episode of the Machine Ethics Podcast. This episode we're talking to Josie Young. We recorded on the 19th of February 2021 and we chat about AI making businesses more efficient but not obviously saving humanity quite yet, how AI ethics landscapes changed over the last 5 years, ethics roles and their collaborators, feminist AI and whether chatbots are over, responsible AI at Microsoft, simply doing cool stuff, and much, much more. Thanks for listening, and if you'd like to find more episodes, go to machine-ethics.net. You can contact us at hello@machine-ethics.net. You can follow us on Twitter at machine_ethics or on Instagram at Machine Ethics Podcast. If you can support the podcast, then go to patreon.com/machine ethics, and I hope you enjoy. Hi, Josie. It's awesome to have you on the podcast. Thanks for spending time with me again, because we saw you back in episode 12, I'm thinking, for CogX 2017, when we first met. Yeah. If you could just introduce yourself, who you are and what you do.
Of course. Hi, Ben. It's great to be here. So my name is Josie Young and I'm currently living in Seattle. I'm a program manager and I work in Microsoft's Ethics and Society team, which is super fun.
Awesome. Thank you. So we met before back in 2017, which seems like so much time has passed since then. And we've both acquired children since that time, so life has happened, pandemics have happened, all sorts of things have occurred. You are now working with Microsoft and you used to work in other places, including in the UK, and you did a master's as well at Goldsmiths. I've got these in my notes, you see. There's a question that we always ask on the podcast, which I can't actually remember if you've answered before, but it's been such a long time that I would like you to answer again. So, Josie, what is AI?
Such a great question. AI is, as we're currently talking about it in the world, is basically super intense machine learning programs. I think when we talk about AI, we're talking about business applications of machine learning programs. So yeah, because I think a lot of sort of what we call AI these days has been, developed out of business or industry, often in collaboration with academia. But yeah, I think AI is at the moment this sort of like enterprise scale machine learning capabilities that trying to mimic, I guess, human capabilities like image recognition, speech recognition, all that kind of stuff. I mean, obviously I would say that because now I work at Microsoft and that's, I'm in that part of that division of the company. So I think it's a very specific perspective, actually.
Yeah. So you think, because it's interesting that you say that it's kind of, it's almost transitioned into this kind of software as a service world or area, which maybe, I don't know, 5 years ago, less so maybe? There's a change, a transitional period there.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, previously it was more like research, theory, what would we need to make this happen? And all those like lovely utopian things of how we can like change the world with AI. Whereas, I don't know if we're changing the world with AI. I think we're making businesses more efficient. And I think we're maybe being able to run some like cool analytics on things that we wouldn't have been able to run analytics on before. So being able to answer questions that we couldn't previously answer, but whether we're doing it on like a scale of, saving humanity, I'm quite sure that's where the focus of AI is primarily at the moment. And also, I remember reading Dr. Genevieve Bell of Australian National University wrote something recently talking about cybernetics. So cybernetics were like, this is all new to me, but cybernetics were like, a cool big thing, sort of like the sort of 60s and 70s. And Genevieve Bell, she wrote this in the Griffith Review recently, and she's basically talking about how, the AI kind of Dartmouth conference in the 1950s, it sort of kicked off this whole like artificial intelligence thing. They were very, very focused on quite specific applications of AI, and basically how do we use computation to replicate the brain. Whereas cybernetics was more about how do we integrate this kind of technology, this kind of thinking with human systems, with culture, and they had anthropologists at their conferences and things like that. And so it's interesting that we're on the AI track, I think, primarily, rather than the cybernetics track, if we were to have continued that.
Yeah.
So,
but I guess there's some overlap there as well, because you can't have one without the other. The application of the machine learning stuff could be for, transhumanist ideas, or this applying them to a more human context.
Yeah, I think so. But I just think it has a whole lot of blind spots, though, because I think I can't imagine if you'd had a conference with psychologists and anthropologists, as well as computer scientists, as well as like information systems people, you wouldn't necessarily have, say, a machine learning powered like sentencing software that was discriminating against Black people, basically. And then when you raise that to the company, they're like, no, there's no bias here. And it's like, there is, because it's institutional racism in this context, and you're amplifying it. So I just think it's, by just going down the AI track, we're like so many blind spots about, oh no, data is not neutral. Just like doing some maths on stuff isn't, neutral. And so I think it's such a narrow scope sometimes, that to our detriment, to be honest.
Yeah. And I think that we've had this kind of discovery period where growing out of big data and the excitement around of big data analytics, and like, oh, we've got all this data, we've got social media, we've got the internet doing all these amazing things, and now we have IoT and like things producing data. What can we do with that, and how do we process that, and how do we make sense out of that stuff? And in my mind, the analytics or the AI machine learning kind of revolution, summer, let's say, summers and winters, people like to talk about, has really grown out of the fact that we've got all this data and we have to do something with it. And most of that is kind of, like you were saying, kind of a business kind of area to make sense out of their data that they control. It's really interesting that we've kind of had to discover for ourselves the pitfalls of like some of that thinking, some of the, just apply this mathematical equation with all this nodal structure and it will just be fine, because like it's technology, and technology doesn't care about anything. It just does what it says. But as we have previously discussed in all these different podcasts, that's not necessarily the case. So
yeah, and it's so tricky. It's so, there's so much nuance as well in trying to, I guess, explain those intricacies to people, because we're led to believe the scientific method produces objective results. It's as close as we can get to kind of objective truth, I guess, in a way. And so if you've been kind of steeped in that, and maybe you've got a science degree of some kind, it doesn't really make sense when the rabid feminist turns up and it says nothing is objective, and everything has different interpretations, everything is subjective. Yeah, it's really tricky to sort of try and peel back the nuance and say, your intention can be good and you can still produce something that creates harm in the world.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Yeah, it is hard. So there is those sorts of kind of discoveries, or those things that we've kind of fallen into accidentally and had to kind of sort out and structure, make some sort of structure, and some of that is to do with what we now call AI ethics, right? So there's this large area which has overlap all over the place, which is kind of AI ethics. And before, maybe people were talking about digital sociology or digital ethics, or and there would be people in universities in humanity departments doing that, and there'll be technicians in computer departments doing AI stuff or analytics stuff, and now those kinds of areas are coming together, in my mind anyway, to create this kind of area of AI ethics. How do you think, as well as those kind of pitfalls, that we've kind of, things have changed over the last 3 years since we met, but maybe last 5 years, kind of how these things have kind of progressed and changed?
I think it's amazing when you and I met at the CogX conference, because I think you were one of the first people that I met when I said, hey, we need to think about this AI ethics thing. And you're like, yeah, totally. And I was like, people don't usually agree with me when I say these things. So it was like so exciting and like awesome. And I think it really is about that, like AI, even though I sort of gave a quite cynical kind of description of what AI is at the moment, we've got all these kind of digital networks around the world that we're now like putting all this like machine learning kind of, autonomous systems stuff into. And that started happening about 5 years ago. And, and until we started to see those kind of negative effects of doing that, like automating these kinds of things at a scale we've never seen before as a society, it's amazing to see how quickly it's changed, and that it is much more mainstream now. To be thinking about the societal impacts of this stuff. I've been pretty I think Europe and the UK was really awesome because everyone kind of naturally thinks about things in this way, and the EU is doing a whole lot of work around principles and all that kind of stuff. It's brilliant. And then over here in the US, it's like a very different perspective. I think the tendency in like Europe and the UK is to think about it kind of top down, policy, principles, governance, and regulation and stuff like that. Whereas what I've found in the US, it's much more kind of actually, where is that harm meeting communities? How are we doing kind of community activism around this? A lot of grassroots mobilization, a lot more focus on kind of applied tools to help teams do things differently, rather than necessarily a tendency to those kind of frameworks and governance and stuff that is maybe more European in bent, if you to compare the two. So I think it is interesting that 5 years ago, no one was really talking about this, and now we're starting to see some pretty consistent but divergent themes from the different regions. And obviously, I'm like super Anglo-centric, so I'm sure there's other stuff in other places I'm definitely not aware of. So yeah, I think it's interesting. When you and I met, I think you and I have always talked about, how do we do this in an applied way? How do we like sit with the teams who are building the technology and like helping them make different decisions and help them think differently about it? And other very smart people can do the kind of policy stuff and the top level stuff. Yeah. Sorry, just rambling at you now.
No,
this is great. It's a great podcast.
That's fantastic. Thanks. I think that's the beauty of podcasts, actually, the less structured ramble chats. So when I was researching you briefly, because it's kind of, because I already know you a little bit, so that helped. But I already know that you've done some work in this area, but you also have on your Twitter account that you are a feminist AI researcher. So I was just wondering if you wanted to qualify what that meant to you, and what it means to be a feminist AI researcher, and why someone might do that.
So I think with anything feminist, it's always completely politically motivated. So when I was doing my chatbot research, when I did my master's back in 2016, 2017, and that was the research I was doing when you and I met. I was sort of trying to understand why are we designing all of our voice bots to be women? So Siri, Alexa, Cortana, Google Assistant all had women's voices, and most of them also have women's names. And so from a feminist perspective, I'm like, I'm not so keen on this. What's going on here? And as I was doing some kind of trying to research, like, what do we have currently in terms of our like academic frameworks, our maybe more applied kind of perspectives on how to really disrupt this way of designing our, that interaction layer with our AI systems. I couldn't really find much. I'm like, surely feminists have a huge amount of opinions on this. And I found opinions from like the 90s, but I couldn't really find many kind of more contemporary kind of academic. And I thought, all right, well, that's clearly a massive problem. And also, I think what I did also observe in my research was that, people were still very narrowly thinking about you. If you work in AI, you have to have a PhD in physics, or you're a computer scientist, or stats. It's all about the stats.
Yeah.
And I thought, actually, that's one of the problems with how we're designing AI, is that our teams are not multidisciplinary. They're way too narrow. They're way too kind of, those kinds of technical skills driven. And so I thought, obviously what the world needs is a feminist AI researcher who can bridge those two worlds by saying, here is a kind of social science framework and way of thinking about the broader effects of what you're building, and then distilling that down in a way that teams who are building stuff day to day can consume and understand, and then alter how they work. So taking those, because I don't think it's fair to assume everyone in a product team is a rabid feminist. I mean, they should be, obviously, but that's like not a fair burden to put on everyone. But what we do need to do is be able to translate those ideas, that way of understanding how societal impacts are going to manifest, based on AI, how you're designing an AI system. And so I guess it's from the perspective of sort of saying, hey, we need to have more people with kind of a social science perspective in the space. And for me, that's being a feminist. But also that we need to really challenge who we give permission to be in AI. And I'm someone who very proudly has never coded a day in my life, but I still think that I have an absolute right to be in the room where this stuff is being built, and it's actually important that people with social science perspectives, as well as the more kind of technical perspectives, can be working together to build more cool stuff, basically.
More cool stuff. So, yeah.
More cool stuff.
And you were talking about that back in 2016, 17, and I find it really interesting because it's a lot of the stuff that we were talking about then as this kind of applied nature. How can we actually help teams enact this stuff? Is things that I have seen starting to happen, which is really nice as well. So in some of the work I've done, and I'm sure some of the work you do now at Microsoft, you're kind of enacting some of that now, which is really pleasing, to have gone, well, we need these people and we're not seeing them at the moment, and then you're suddenly seeing them, or teams are incorporating some of that learnings into how they operate, and then hopefully into those projects, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think in the last definitely less than a year, in the last year, there is a growth in jobs coming out for people who can do that bridging. So previously, hardcore data scientist, this is the person who works in AI.
Yep.
Heap of roles out for that type of person. Maybe you'd have a social science researcher who's doing some academic research on the impacts of AI in society.
Yep.
But those two will never meet, kind of a thing. Whereas in the last 12 months, and I don't know if you've seen this as well, more and more roles are coming up that are this hybrid kind of, and often it's sort of someone maybe with a policy or a project management background who can do the bridging really well, and who can work effectively with a range of people in a team to help think through those kind of social impacts of what you're building, but also provide a structured way to move through that product development life cycle and actually produce something that's high quality at the end, which is cool, which I think is the way forward. And I'm hoping, and I think, I would say that, Microsoft is really investing in this, and which is one of the reasons why I was over the moon to get to kind of work in this team. But how do we prove to everyone that having these multidisciplinary teams actually drives innovation, and you produce better quality stuff at the end, actually, and that is, in and of itself, is good too, and important too. So I think with the feminist chatbot research that I did, one of the amazing collaborations I got to do after that was with the Feminist Internet. And they used my research to design a workshop for students at the University of the Arts London to build feminist Alexa prototypes. It's so fun and so cool. And, I think they came up with 6 prototypes in total. And these are students, so they're prototypes, but just like the way that this like amazing collection of students across a range of disciplines were able to work together to build things that were designed to meet like meaningful human needs. They thought very carefully about the conversation design. They thought carefully about, you know, what kind of data. Oh, they didn't talk about data actually. They talked more about like those, how would, in say in the conversation design, would the voice bot handle harassment, for example? And yeah, just like, and also it was really fun. Like one of the voice bots would read out RuPaul quotes, but like in a robot voice. And it was the greatest thing I've ever heard. It's so good. So yeah, it just like proved to me like, you know, all of these prototypes were so innovative and so interesting and needed by these different communities. But I couldn't necessarily see, so like Amazon creating those kinds of skills on their own. It would need to have come from, you know, a more diverse community, I guess. So yeah, I just think that there is something really, really cool we've not explored yet enough as an industry around, you know, using these tools and these perspectives to actually like make cooler stuff, more cool stuff.
More cool stuff. I like that. That's going to be a sound bite like, that goes at the end of just make cool stuff. This is a bit of a piffy comment, but like, are chatbots over?
I mean, maybe. I think it's all voice assistants now.
True. Yeah.
But yes, no, I think, yeah, possibly.
I mean, I don't think they've rocked my world as they were. You know what I mean? That the service that they often provide is suboptimal, you know, to something else, which could be a search. That's fine. A search is fine, or could be direct contact with, you know, a person, or possibly direct contact with a database that is going to go crunch something and then come back to me with an answer, and that's kind of a different way to do it as well. But like this informational chat that is supposed to be useful hasn't really, kind of changed my worldview and all that. But again, with voice as well. But I might be speaking from my particular viewpoint, which is that, you know, obviously the privacy aspects of some of these things is questionable with the voice, you know, the voice devices. So I don't necessarily have them in my house. But it's almost like, you know, something like VR or something like that. It hasn't really hit the public consciousness as much, or that's what I feel like it hasn't anyway.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think, you know, I don't have voice bots in my life really. I turn off those features. I guess, and you know, and I think part of it is, you know, again, you can't separate these systems and products from the companies that build them. So I'm like, I mean, with Alexa, I'm like very suspicious of the motives behind that product, and how I'm being used as a data point for a massive business that has only made more money as a result of a pandemic. You know, so I'm very suspicious of those things. But also I think, you know, coming back to like chatbots, I think it's actually just like, I think people didn't realize how hard it is to make a good one. You know, it's hard to find the right use case or the right like scenario to where a chatbot is the best way forward. And then, you know, do the research and the design work to, you know, to have a good conversation design that lines up, you know, it sets expectations with the user, but lines up with the, you know, the data you have to make it work. And yeah, so I think, but I think when that sweet spot is identified, I think it can work really well. So there's the Clio Bot, which is a financial services bot where it's basically meant to be like a digital friend that keeps an eye on your money for you. And the conversation design is very feminist. They use a lot of GIFs, they have, you know, jokes, they do a lot of very rapid kind of research and development work with their customers about the tone of voice and the way that they communicate different things. So I think, you know, and that, I think that works quite well. And that's a really, you know, it's a really great product. And so they've found that sweet spot and they've invested in doing it well. Whereas, you know, when you're a massive company that just wants an FAQ bot, well, you're not going to invest in the same way, are you? You're not going to actually want the bot to have a personality that's kind of identifiable. It'll probably, be a bot that's named after the daughter of the CEO, for example. So I think because they're pretty, like, they can be quite cheap and easy to produce, but that doesn't necessarily make them good, which kind of sucks because you can have some good ones. I think you can have some good, like the Clio one is really cool. There's also there's this great example I read. I think Nesta had a write-up about it, where they had a chatbot that was part of a primary school. And so there was like, whenever all the kids came in, there was like a big panel of like smiley faces or like sad faces or, different like emoticons representing different emotions. And all the kids would like hit the one that they were feeling that day.
Yeah.
And it gave the school like this pulse check of like the vibe at the school that day. And then there was a chatbot that accompanied it that was all about supporting these kids to be emotionally literate and connecting them with each other. So like peer-to-peer support networks and stuff as well. So, and I was like, that is just such a lovely example of thinking about how can we use this technology to enhance well-being in a primary school.
Yeah.
And then you've got your privacy concerns and like make sure that's not hackable, obviously. But I just thought that's just so nice. That's so cool. So I think there are some spaces where it's a role for a chatbot yet, but it is I think hard to find that nice sweet spot.
That sounds really interesting. I'll have to find that and put it in the notes as well. It's nice because you want those for, being a parent, you want those activities that you have with digital technologies to have some sort of connection at some point, because obviously a lot of them it's consumption and it's faceless, kind of communication almost. I know that we are actually talking now and I can see you, so not so faceless, but like having a bot like ask Jimmy to see if you're okay because you're feeling down that day or something like that. That's super cool. Like, that's really nice.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you are able to tell us what you have been up to somewhat at Microsoft.
Yeah. All right. I'm gonna try and give you a good rundown.
Yep. Sorry. I guess some of the aspects I'm interested in is because it's a big company, right? So I'm interested to why they might have hired people like you in that team that you work, and kind of what the remit is, that sort of thing. What can you touch and what can you affect, and what kinds of jobs and activities you do.
Yeah, totally. So one of the reasons I've always been quite interested in this team is because, like we've already discussed, one important side of transformation when we talk about ethical AI is like supporting the people directly who are building the stuff. And it actually, translating principles into action is very, very difficult. And, the ethics and society team at Microsoft has been, I think it was set up in like 2017, maybe, by Mira Lane. And she's just our resident genius. She's amazing. It was really thinking about how do we bring a design and research kind of mentality to this and have it connect with product. And I think it's really super unique. And the fact that, this is a team that Microsoft's resourcing, it's important. And since then, they've grown out their responsible AI sort of infrastructure in the company. So there's the Office for Responsible AI that set the policy and the standards. There's the ETHA working groups that are sort of our genius academics who are really sort of trying to keep, I guess, the company, aware of trends and then, solutions to different things as that they come about. And then with a team like Ethics and Society, we work more closely with product teams. So working with them directly to say, thinking about our, responsible AI principles at Microsoft, this is how you can bring them to life with the product that you're building. And so our team is like multidisciplinary, which is really cool. We've got lots of research and design, and it's just like blow my mind every day with a lot of like sharing within the team. And I'm just like, everyone here is amazing. It's very tiring. Being around such smart people. And then like I'm a program manager, so we've got our PMs as well. And we just kind of go and work directly with product teams and do cool stuff. So one example that was actually released recently is the custom neural voice product. And that is where people can basically like build a synthetic voice, which is really cool. But obviously there's a lot of different, things we need to think about with that type of technology. And so it has been released and we've got a gate over it. So you need to apply to be able to get access to the technology. There's a series of questions that kind of, try to understand what you want to use it for, and whether that's sort of, I guess, in line with the kind of uses that Microsoft thinks are appropriate with this tech. So I've, been involved in that as well, and just really thinking about how do we see end to end all the possible kind of impacts, and work with product teams to I guess, manage them, hopefully eliminate all the bad ones, and then make sure that, when it's out in the world that, that's, we've sorted all that out. So yeah, it's pretty unique space actually. And the team itself is made up of people who've, really variety of backgrounds, multidisciplinary in terms of experience as well as skills as well as disciplines, which is cool.
No, sounds lush.
Yeah, it's pretty good. I definitely.
Sounds terrible.
It's worth moving across the world in a pandemic for.
That's
definitely.
true. You did move from the UK to the US during the lockdown last year, or not the lockdown. It was just afterwards, I think. But it was a strange time.
I think it was before the lockdown was lifted, actually.
Was
so
it?
we couldn't see anyone. So we'd been in London for like 6 years, and then left,
and then you had to quarantine as well when you got there.
Yeah. I mean, we didn't know anyone.
Yeah.
So
that's true.
It wasn't hard.
That's true.
To quarantine.
Goodness gracious me. Well, that sounds great. This is probably going to be a no, but I was wondering, when you're working with these teams in this job or your previous positions, whether, you're working with those teams and you maybe get a bit pushback, being that person. From in an industry that's traditionally been, break things, fix them later, whatever sort of style. What kinds of things do people usually have problems with or gripes with or need more understanding on?
I think initially it's just like a misalignment of mindsets. Like quite often I can say something and people will just look at me like I have two heads. Like, why are you... This is a data science project. Why are you talking to me about user research? Like, it's none of this that makes sense. And which I'm sure you've experienced as well. Yep. And so I think it's really, and again, this is where this kind of bridging idea happens. Like, I often front up to, and, more so probably in my previous role, but, turning up to teams that honestly have never thought about things from this perspective before. And so I am like an alien and I'm standing here grinning at them, being like, I'm going to take you on a journey, mate. It's going to be something else. And they're like, I didn't sign up for this journey. What on earth are you? What are you going to do to me? So I think it's like really recognizing where people are at and really trying to find that kind of shared language. So a couple of years ago, I was working on a data science project and I'd been really trying hard to sell this idea of, hey, maybe we need to go and talk to the stakeholders who are going to be affected by this thing that you're building, maybe, and, got quite a bit of pushback on that. And then I realized I had an ally in the data scientist that we were working with because they needed to understand more context in the data that they were using to train all of the stuff. And the only way we were going to get that context is by going to the stakeholders. And so I almost had to kind of Trojan horse a couple of things into, because they, this client, definitely agree with everything the data scientist said and was very comfortable not agreeing with anything that I said. So I basically had to say, okay, well, they understand that framework, they trust that framework. So I need to find a way of expressing, the need to have user research, the need to think about this from a service design perspective, the need to really understand the context of this huge data set that they were using. I had to try and repackage that into the language and the process and the approaches that they already trusted. And work very quickly to demonstrate the value. Like, this is how this has made the quality of this product better. And that's why it's important. And so there's, a bit of kind of Trojan horsing going along, and then really trying to convert it into impact and saying, hey, look, this thing was like way better because we asked the question. If we hadn't have asked the question, this, you would have been stuck with something that you couldn't use in this way, for example.
I think that's really one of the most difficult bits, because it's almost like, if measuring that impact of the work is tricky, because if you've done the work, then maybe you won't have seen the negative side of things in such stark reality. But if you hadn't done the work, you would have been stuck with the bad stuff, possibly. So, quantifying that is actually quite difficult, I would say. So you have to kind of justify it in different ways. Do you, is that the same with you? Kind of the justification of your job is difficult, or are people getting on board with that now?
I think because, Microsoft has been talking about their responsible AI principles for a little while now. There is the broader infrastructure across the company. So it's not just me on my
Hmm.
own saying, hey, this is important. It's, there's a whole lot more of us. And I know, and this was said to me by quite a few people before I joined the company, but I think, under the CEO, Satya, there's been a huge change in culture and just general vibe
Mm.
at the company. And I think the responsible AI conversation has really benefited from that. So, I think a lot of hard work had already kind of been done in different ways to make that easier,
Hmm.
which is great. And when you have a company of that size and something does get mandated from the top, it's a very different authorizing environment than, if you're a consultant,
Yeah.
and you've got to come into an existing culture and practice that you don't have any control over, and you're not necessarily going to be there long term. So yeah, so it is quite a different dynamic, actually.
Mm.
Yeah, but I mean, I do like a challenge. So I did enjoy my previous role of just basically turning up and smiling at people for long enough until they started to agree with me. So yeah,
Um,
I don't know. I mean, what's been your experience of it? Because it is like the biggest barrier is just getting that trust and that buy-in really quickly.
Yeah, I think it's the economic, the value, which is the difficult one. So you have to try and, especially the work I do is often directly to business, right? So you're trying to
Mm.
sell in yourself to a business, and you're essentially selling, you know, we need to do these things, otherwise it's going to go badly. It's almost a due diligence sort of style position, and no one likes risk people. No one likes just due diligence people. The legal department, they're the no, they just say no to everything, right? So it's about like trying to convey the value that you bring for creating better products, which hopefully better suit the people you're trying to target, and hopefully are just generally better for society, and trying to convey that idea is in a terms that some of these people understand is quite difficult. I found it's quite a hard sell, but I think, like we were saying earlier, that there's just been more coverage of the sorts of things that have gone wrong, and just kinds of things that you might see actually in the media now, which have slightly made that easier for us. But like you were saying earlier about some teams just like never having thought about it, you still do get these conversations with people, and you're like, yeah, I mean, we haven't really done anything like that, or we haven't done an ethics workshop, or we haven't really thought about the impacts of this, or all these sorts of conversations you'll have with people, and you're like, this is mental. You hire me now, hire me now,
Please,
hire
yes, give me all your
us. Like
money.
lots of people in this space now, but yeah, no, sometimes
Yeah.
it is literally mental and gets me a little bit upset when I have these conversations, because sometimes there'll be with people who are like dealing with medical data or something, and I'm like, you
Mm.
guys, what the f, come on. So yeah, enough of that ramble, but
I do think it's funny. It's sometimes I tactically don't talk about ethics. Like I just
mm,
never say the word. And I've had experiences where I have said the word and I've got an immediate pushback. So it's really interesting what you say about that kind of like, the risk, no one wants people to come in and tell them no, and people get nervous when there's someone with a risk mindset
mhm,
around, and they think they're just going to be told everything that's broken
yeah,
and not be given a way to fix it as well, I think. And also I think some people, back to what we sort of said at the start, like some people just think that machine learning, data science is objective. And so there's no room for ethics because, either the data is just reflecting the world the way it is. And so, what can you do about that? Or the kind of calculations are inherently good because they uncover more truth, even if there is a bias inherent in that is misleading you or can lead to poor decision making. So yeah, I think it's really tricky to understand, all right, where's the main part of what's the main source of your resistance to this? And then working with that. It is hard. I do think ultimately it needs to be that push to quality. The quality is just going to be so much better. Trust me on this. This is how I make your product look great.
Yeah, and that's a good justification for more diversity as well, the quality stuff. Because it's, better ideas, more fitting for your different users, less impacts the users you haven't thought about because we'll think about them, all this sort of good stuff. Do you think is there stuff which is niggling at you, things that we haven't really sorted out yet, and when we talk about AI ethics, and what other things left to do you think, or the areas that have kind of more space for research?
I think one of the things that really struck me coming over to North America is that connection to on the ground organizing and ethics. I think in the UK, I realized that I could probably spend a heap of time talking about AI ethics and never actually really get to the heart of social justice issues or organizing or mobilizing around social justice issues. Whereas I think that lived experience really drives a huge number of academic research work in the US, as well as changes for policy and stuff. So I think we do, as a space, we're pretty white, we're pretty privileged, and so really being aware of that and taking steps to connect the AI ethics work that we do to actual on the ground kind of political resistance and improvements. I think that's a blind spot, definitely for me, that I've been thinking about. And also, I think we're on our way to having these more multidisciplinary approaches and having a designer and a data scientist in the team, and that making sense to people. But I do think we still just need to keep working on those muscles and making that more commonplace. And one thing that I would love to see us doing is attaching a carbon counter to things, within, when we look at how we're training models, the amount of effort it takes to then run that model again, what is the carbon counter on that? What are you doing about that? How can your kind of carbon impact of your model, how can that factor be one of the deciding factors when you're choosing which model to run, whether to deploy something or not? So
yeah. I mean, that's a really good point. I think all this comes down to what you said at the beginning about doing good, right, with this technology. And if we're not kind of at both ends making sure that it's doing good, in the making of it and also in the deployment of it, then we're probably failing somewhere, aren't we, on the ethical kind of reason or purpose of it. It took a whole year's worth of electricity of a small town to make this. And we're just selling better ads.
Yay!
Great.
Exactly.
Ooh, go us.
Yeah, and and I think we all get, because we all love cool stuff. We get so caught up in, oh my god, we can do this amazing new things now, which is great and may have an application in selling more ads. But at the same time, do you remember the conversations when people were saying, oh, but but machine learning is a black box. There's no way we could ever interpret the results. Well, now we have lots of ways of interpreting results, because people have put in the effort to build the tools and make that a priority. And so everything here is person made. And so I think it's more about really questioning why we're not investing in that thing. Is it because it's inconvenient? Is it because it just might be low on the priority list, and rather than that it's impossible, I think. So I think that's kind of, we're in the game of convincing people that this stuff isn't impossible anymore.
Nice.
Which is
That's a really good
Fun, rewarding.
it's a really good message to leave us all with. But I do have one more question for you, Josie, if you have time. Is that okay?
Mhm.
Yep.
Yeah.
So the last question we always ask on the podcast is, what are you excited about, and what scares you about this AI, digital, machine learning mediated future?
Ooh, I'm excited about I'm excited about driverless cars. I want one. It's going to be great. I'm
Yeah.
ready. So I'm excited about driverless cars, and I'm excited about driverless cars because I think there's an opportunity to, if we think about these kind of integrated transport networks, and if we apply it in a way that makes movement around a city accessible to everyone, it could be a really amazing way of addressing fuel poverty, of, not, I guess, punishing people because they have to live further out of town, away from their jobs. So I think it could be a really interesting way of I guess, approaching, like, social justice, inclusion things in our cities. And London particularly, it would just be incredible. So I'm really excited about that. And the thing that terrifies me is that we are automating our values and our biases into these systems without thinking. We then deploy them on a massive scale, and we've not yet figured out how to take responsibility for the impacts of that. And that stresses me out
Right.
in a significant way.
And do you have any answers for that, or is that just a thing that is being worked out, played out right now?
I mean, if you look at, like, the recent US election, with all of the bots on Twitter and, all these kind of, misinformation campaigns, and just it just is incredible how quickly something can spread and how quickly it tangibly changes how societies run. That just can't stand. We can't, be beholden to that as a society anymore. And it really has to be regulation. It has to be government saying this is not the type of society that we want to have, and we have a duty to safeguard. So, I think there needs to be a limit on how, like, algorithmically driven things are on platforms, especially like social media platforms. But I think in a lot of ways our political leaders are catching up, because this technology has been driven out of business, and just hasn't necessarily had the same kind of oversight and investment from the public sector as other innovations in the past have had. The kind of line of sight is not as clear as it used to be. And so I think, governments are playing catch up. I know the UK government has done and Parliament has done a huge amount of work in the last few years to play catch up and be on top of this stuff. But yeah, I think that we need to see that happening more and more. So back to that political mobilization, everybody.
Nice.
Write to your local member.
Well, write to them and kind of hopefully tell them what the issue is, describe the issue. Because one of the things that we were butting up against in some of my work is that these leaders aren't always tech literate or necessarily up on the latest AI trends, right? So there's a certain kind of disconnect there, which is probably part of the problem. But like you said, they are, there is effort there to try and do something about that. So hopefully that would be good. I don't know if you remember, but do you remember watching the trial with Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg last year in the US?
Oh, I think I don't know if I caught much of it. I caught some of it, though.
It was really funny. Like, it's because it was filmed and televised. The questions and the things that some of the members were asking Mark Zuckerberg were just wholly inappropriate, or like for how the thing works, right? So it's kind of like just Mark just sitting there going, rolling his eyes, going, another stupid question. Okay, well, no, it doesn't work like that, but da 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 da, like continuously, and it was like so annoying, so frustrating for people who like had better questions. You know what I mean? Would take him to task. It's unfortunate, but I mean, they weren't all bad, but a lot of them were bad.
Yeah. No, I think I remember a clip of him saying, we make money through advertising. And the guy was like, that doesn't make sense. And you're like, oh God, this is so terrible.
Days of this, days.
Oh, I know. And I think that's a really interesting kind of symptom of, in Europe, in the UK, the mindset is public institutions need to respond to these issues. So, principles at a government level, regulation, there's the all party parliamentary group
All party.
on
Yeah.
AI and party time. And so that's there and that's working. Whereas over here in the US, any kind of action has actually happened at a state level and has been driven by local campaigns and mobilizations.
Right.
So the Algorithmic Justice League are doing an amazing amount of work in this space, but it's locally driven. So and because they just think about it in a completely flipped way. So I'm like, I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
Really not surprised. I mean, it sucked. It shouldn't be like that.
Yeah.
But I'm not surprised that Mark Zuckerberg was just like, not really giving away any secrets in that questioning.
Yeah, exactly.
So. Yeah.
Well, I think we've come to the end now. You've got to go to work, and I have got to go to the weekend because it's Friday night for me over here. So thank you so much for your time. How do people find out about you, follow you, and connect?
So I'm on Twitter at Swords to Young. I mainly retweet and like things. So I'm a good lurker. And also you can track me down on LinkedIn as well. So reach out if you've got any questions about feminist chatbots. I'm your girl.
Always. So thanks very much for your time, and I'll hopefully speak to you soon.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me.
Hi, and welcome to the end of the podcast. Thanks again to Josie. Really nice to have an opportunity to speak to her, and also it's nice to speak to another embedded AI ethics person who's down in the trenches doing this work. Please go follow her on Twitter and LinkedIn. Check out more episodes at machine-ethics.net, and if you can, support us at patreon.com/machineethics. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.